Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with my co host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
I'm very good today. Thanks very much.
So, today is a conversation I've been looking forward to having personally and collectively with Mark for ages and ages. It's something I've read about, but it's never been something I've ever got to discuss. It is all because today our guest is Dr. Jay Sanguinetti. Jay is a philosopher, a neuroscientist, and a cognitive psychologist who got his PhD at the University of Arizona, where he continues to do some work. At the moment, he's investigating how technology can be used to augment a meditation practice, which, as it happens, is the topic of today's conversation. Jay, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
Just before you got on, I said to Mark, "Hey, have you seen the movie Limitless?" And while I assume that's not what's happening here, there is this interesting comparison where in the film someone takes a pill to make more of their brain turn on. That's the premise, slightly Hollywood. Your work is investigating initially whether we can use technology, perhaps ultrasounds, to enhance some part of the meditation process. Is that a characterization that sounds right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're trying to use technology. You can sort of think of it like training wheels for meditation. So we're not trying to replace meditation. We're not trying to get you hooked on technology, but we're trying to use it as a way to accelerate, facilitate, or in sort of science speak, you might think of it like a catalyst, like a chemical catalyst, sort of getting the system gelled up so that when you meditate, you get more of the benefit every time you sit and practice.
So at the moment, if I sit down and practice, where is the benefit on this model coming from?
That's a great question, and as you might guess, I'll give you a short scientific answer, and then we can dig into it.
Yeah,
But
nice.
it really depends on how much practice you have, and this will get into the Bayesian brain and all the things I think we can talk about here. But we're really looking at three groups of people: beginners, never meditated; people in the middle who've tried a bit but maybe are stuck in their practice; and then the fun group are the long-term meditators who are completely different people. And even the same brain area, so we're using focused brain stimulation. Even the same area, you get different effects depending on how much practice you have.
Wow.
Richie Davison calls these Olympic meditators, like Olympians. These are really special type of people who've trained really hard. And so there's a lot different about their nervous system, and we have to caveat that maybe they were different to start with, which is why they became who they are, right? So we can't say for sure, right? The meditation totally did all this, but this is a special group of people, and I think that they have an internal language, so they have a way to describe what's happening to them. This is more subtle, but they also have the attention tools to really tune in to what's changing. And then I think what happens for them is they notice some change, they can work with that change in their practice, and then it becomes like a biofeedback loop, but it's like a sort of mind feedback in a sense.
Wow, it's fascinating. Hold on, Jamie, one second. Can you give us a specific here? I mean, give us what's an example of something that you might be able to do in this sort of hardwired way that they're able to make use of if you have lots of practice.
Sure. So we've been targeting part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which is a deep part of the brain, deals with dopamine and all kinds of interesting sort of reward networks. And what you find is that with long-term practice, this dopamine center changes quite a bit because it deals with automatic habits.
Right.
And in long-term meditators, well, let me back up. So when we try this brain area in non-meditators to try
Yep.
to catalyst, you get a whole range of experience report. So we do like experiential reporting, and there's no consistency. Some people love it, some people are a little bit uncomfortable. It's not adverse, but it's sort of like you're disrupting their automatic habits, right? Some people don't like that because those habits are there for a reason. And then a
Mm,
lot of people kind of say, "Oh, I don't really feel much." And that's kind of the average report. Whereas if
okay.
you take the same number of people, but now they all have 30 years of experience, the average report is like, "Oh, I know what to do with this," which is sort of like they describe it as a bit like a body equanimity, meaning that
Uh,
their body is they're sort of really embodied, first of all, so getting out of the sort of mind space and really into feeling the body, the sensations of the body. But then that allows them to have equanimity with that, which means being very open to whatever's happening. So pain, pleasure, whatever's going on, they recognize it as a boost in that capacity. And then it becomes very pleasurable for most of them. So they
Right.
kind of go from like, oh, I know what this is like. It's like being on meditation retreat for a few days, to then going deeply in it. And then when they go deeply in it, it triggers this reward state because I think it usually takes them so long to try to get there, in a meditation retreat.
So now you're doing
So a lot
better.
of these folks,
You're doing
yeah,
better than expected at getting into, rather than doing better than expected at getting some juice, or
hmm
you're doing better than expected getting into a state that you're after. And so you're getting some reward feedback that that was well done. Interesting.
right, right. And then they're like, okay, and then they meditate. So usually the protocol is they meditate for 30 minutes to an hour after we do the brain stimulation. And so most long-term meditators know like how much effort it's going to take to get into a certain state that they might define. And kind of what they're saying is this is sort of helping them get there much faster. Then when they're there, the meditation is really rewarding. So whatever the rewards are for them in that meditation.
Wow.
It's interesting because even though we're calling the newbie meditating the same activity, meditating, or more specifically, meditating on the breath, as the experts, I sort of probably live in that intermediate, beginning of that intermediate camp. And
hmm
I know if I'm having a sit that's more focused or I'm on retreat or whatever it is, I can experience that loop. Like my actual experience, even though it's still on the breath, I'm referring to myself. It's like a meta self-referential activity that I'm not doing when I sit down and I'm chaotic. And I wonder whether one of the differences as to why these are different things in the brain is because it's actually not the same activity. We're calling it the same activity, but they're different.
hmm For sure. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you target, so we're targeting the caudate nucleus, which is kind of the head part of the basal ganglia. It's massively connected to networks in the brains. It's all networks, right? And so even though we're targeting one or two spots, you're changing the dynamic network activity. And I think one thing that long-term practice does is it changes dynamic network activity, right? So their brain, that's what I'm saying. It's almost like the brain kind of knows what to do with it because it's done that for 30 years, right? Whereas a beginner, you change the dynamic activity and the brain is like, well, wait a minute, what do I do with this? And they don't have a physiological language, if you want to call it that, or whatever the brain is doing. They don't have a mental language. So there's multiple levels of like the brain and the person, which aren't really separate, but you know what I mean, right? The whole multi levels of the system, it's all trying to figure out how to stay at a homeostasis and behaviorally activate, right? That's what it's trying to figure out what to do. And it now you've perturbed it, and now it's got to figure out like, what do I do with this perturbation, right? And different people who don't have experience with that respond totally differently. Whereas a long-term meditator's basically spent their life trying to figure out how to deal with that.
It makes a lot of sense that for some people it can be uncomfortable. I think you already said
Yeah.
it, but I know I can just feel it. If you suddenly let down the defenses that the habits are meant to support, then you're exposed. And exposure doesn't feel good when you start doing it. It takes a little bit to get that equanimity is a nice thing. I mean, when you first sort of step back and go, oh, I'm fine, a guardian jumps up quick and goes, wait, hold on. What do you mean you're fine? Because that's a sort of dangerous state to be in if you're fine. You're supposed to be not fine. That's what we've been predicting is a nice way to get like survival payback in your sort of niche. So you better not be fine. Fine is no kind of fine. So it's cool that for the advanced practitioner who's come to realize that being fine is just fine, then you can hijack the system in a way, put them into a fine state, and then they can work from it from there. It's really fascinating.
Ab- Absolutely. Yeah, and that gets in, I think, where you want to go, which is like the sort of ethics and container that you do this inside of, and the expectations, the mental model, the mental set is what they call it, but the kind of belief structure that you bring to the experiment or to the clinic is crucial in my point of view. Because if I don't tell you that, hey, I might disrupt your okayness,
Yeah.
and the person goes, well, what's okayness?
Yeah.
And if they don't know, if I really believe as a researcher, that's what I'm really disrupting, and they don't have a concept of that, it makes sense that you're going to get a lot of different experiences. Whereas what we do in the lab now is we start teaching people meditation first.
Nice.
They get familiar with these concepts. They update their beliefs about equanimity and all this. And then when they're ready, then they get the ultrasound or they get the brain stimulation. And now they have a way to understand, kind of what's happening to them.
Fascinating. I suspect that this is a little bit of a straw man because I don't think it's such a big issue, especially with this experiment. Lots of the neural enhancement, lots of stuff that's happening in the neural enhancement community, I feel a little bit suspicious about sometimes because I don't know if we should shorten the way so much because each step along the way changes the network relationships in a really profound and important way, I think. And if you jump some steps in order to get fruit without building the tree correctly, I'm always a little bit worried about those sorts of leaps. But
Yeah.
this seems like actually a great candidate for something that I feel much less suspicious about. So again, this might be a bit of a straw man, but is there any worry that, first of all, it doesn't sound like this is going to become something that people want to use every day in their practice. Maybe not. But if it did become a regularly used thing, in your opinion, is there anything that you're missing by not learning to attain shamatha and to obtain equanimity with shamatha in a flash, rather than because, like you said, it takes a couple of days. Well, it takes a couple of days for that level, but that's not for everybody. Lots of people can move through these states probably with more control over time. By cutting out that piece of the training, do you think you're losing anything overall? Like if this was to be used more frequently?
That's a great question and something we worry about. And actually, Shinzen Young is my collaborator on this work, and he's a well-known meditation teacher, started something called Unified Mindfulness. So Shinzen and I joke that this is the problem we hope we have, right? So it's not a problem now because the tech, just isn't powerful enough. But as we build more sophisticated tech, which lots of people are doing, Elon Musk is implanting, electrodes in people's brains. They just got FDA approval. That's all for clinical stuff right now. But at some point in the next 50 years, if we make it as a species, we can sidebar that if you want to talk about it. But we will have the capacity with these very, very sophisticated brain stimulation technologies and probably certain types of designer chemical drugs and things like that might make that possible. And what we think about that in two ways. One way is that I do think some internal effort. I think something about the thing that we're struggling with, which is the sense of self, the ego, the whatever you want to call it, the human being that's inside of all of this flesh that's sitting down to meditate. It's really important from our point of view to have that engaged in the process. That if it becomes, I passively put on Jay's stimulation helmet and now I got shamatha and I don't do anything, then I think what starts happening is you start disengaging the sense of self from the experience. And the key here is these things need to be together until they realize what they really are. If you're a Buddhist, right, no self or whatever, or if you're a secular person, just becoming a fully healthy human being in your body. So like having embodied cognition. And whatever the goal is of that person, I think it's really important that the tech engages the goals of that person.
Right.
Instead of just stimulating one-off states, because then you have a very, very dangerous technology.
Right. So then I guess then the conversation shifts to being something that's actually quite familiar in the Buddhist community. For instance, there's lots of debate even in lots of the older texts about jhana. You go to Thailand, lots of teachers in Thailand will warn you from doing jhana, saying, look, you can get attracted in a way that's not necessarily healthy. You got to be careful of how much time you spend here. Even the Buddha passed this technology over in order to do something more robust and more with a lot more longevity in mind.
Right.
So then maybe the conversation isn't that new from that perspective, because there too, they're going, look, there's a technology. It can be useful. It can hijack some systems to give you glimpses of high level states that can be useful, but you don't want to misuse it. And it's always been sort of up to the practitioner to be able to, in their own way, probably with a good teacher, explore states and traits and abilities and know when to pick them up and when to put them down. But that takes all that agency you're just talking about now, rather than it being a completely passive process. It has to be part of a program in a way.
100%. Yep. And I think, well, great for us, right? We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. People have been talking about this for thousands of years. So
Right.
we need to modernize it, use the modern language and tech and bring the wisdom or knowledge, into what we're creating. So that's partly what we're doing, partly why, I consciously, partner with Shenzhen. Shenzhen partnered with me because we're
Nice.
trying to fuse these things together. And I think, but I also think from like a neuroscience and biological point of view, that's a realistic point of view because what the Buddhists call impermanence, or the what Heraclitius called, change, right? This thing is changing all the time. So if we're hyper focused on state and getting people to a state like Jhana state or
Mm,
whatever it is, it's actually not totally accurate from my point of view
oof.
as a
Yeah.
neuroscientist because this
Yeah.
whole thing is changing all the time,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And you can use a religious context or not, it doesn't matter. I like to
Yeah.
use the scientific one, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing is like even if I get you to the state a lot, it's learning, even if you're not aware. Like on many levels, there's learning
Sure.
occurring. When you sleep, even when you're unaware, your brain's still learning from that stuff. I mean, there's a whole thing, a whole mechanism going on here.
Yeah.
And I think if we're going to have a scientific fusing of a lot of this stuff, then we have to take that viewpoint
Yeah.
that this thing will be changing over time. And we have to create tech that has that viewpoint, which is longitudinal, it's expensive, it's hard to make money off of something where you got to think about a human developing over their lifetime, all of that. But
Yeah.
that's really what's happening here. Right.
What can we just talk? I'm interested in the ultrasound specifically. So, what is it about ultrasounds that look like they might stimulate some of these states?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, normally in brain stimulation, it's electrical stimulation. That's what most people think about. You think about like the shock to the head, electroshock therapy. There's been a lot of advances, even onto Elon Musk's company, where they're implanting really tiny electrodes and they electrically stimulate. The problem with that, you have to use brain surgery or you have to shock the crap out of someone, right? That's the option there. To get the electricity focused in the brain is quite hard because electricity just goes wherever it's going to go. So, a lot of researchers, including myself for a long time, have dreamed of a safe, non-invasive, meaning no surgery, type of technology that you can wear that gets you basically anywhere in the brain. So it can get that energy focused. And that's what focused ultrasound can do. Because it's sound waves instead of electricity, as soon as you get it through the skull, and that's a big problem for us is getting across the barrier. But if you get the ultrasound through the skull, then you can focus it literally to anywhere in the brain, including deep parts like the thalamus or the hippocampus or basal ganglia. That becomes very exciting from a neuroscience point of view because now I can reach parts of the brain that electricity has a really hard time with.
And when you hit the hippocampus with the ultrasounds, for example, or any part of the brain, why does that stimulate the brain?
That's a good question. So hippocampus, I haven't done that on myself because it's such an important brain structure. um, so, yeah, probably should have used that as an example. There-
It's like 50-50. Either you forget who you are or you remember all of the yous you've been.
I
exactly.
assumed they were all quite important.
Yeah, the hippocampus is especially important. But well, especially important for the sense of self. So again, it really depends on your goal here and what you expect to happen. But they are stimulating. You call it sonicating. So a new word for your listeners. When you stimulate the brain with ultrasound, you sonicate it. So they're sonicating the hippocampus in Alzheimer's and dementia patients, and that's actually working in a couple studies that just came out from Harvard, for example. But mostly we're targeting like the posterior cingulate cortex, which is a relatively deep structure involved in the default mode network. And what's really interesting about this is that most of the literature would suggest, so meditation literature, psychedelic literature, and sort of clinical literature, that if you could temporarily disrupt the default mode network, that would be really helpful for meditation learning. Not that you want to get rid of it or turn it off, but the default mode network is kind of the part of the brain that might interfere a bit with meditation training, especially if you're focusing out like on your breath. And that's because it's like the part of the brain when you're thinking to yourself, mind wandering, you're trying to meditate and then like 10 minutes goes by and you've like thought about moving to India and what you would eat when you moved to India, meeting the Dalai Lama in India. That's kind of default mode stuff. So, we try to disrupt that temporarily so that you can gain more of the attention skill. And with ultrasound, you can either disrupt brain activity, sort of inhibit it. We also think you can excite, so you can actually do both ways. And that, believe it or not, depends on how long you keep the ultrasound on, so the pulse of it, which is kind of interesting. But
So
it's
it's
kind of
like
new science.
you can like poke it and then it will keep activating. But if you keep hitting it, then the signals aren't communicating there anymore. So somehow the volume goes down. Is that right? Something like that.
That's one idea. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
couple
Wow.
ideas because you're changing the electrical properties of the lipid bilayer in the cell, but you're also changing the environment because it's literally shaking with ultrasound. So
Wow.
you're probably acting on it through fluid mechanics. You're probably acting on it by changing the excitability. We don't know yet. There's like 8 hypotheses out there. You can go read my recent paper from last year.
I will. Yeah, and we'll link it. We'll link it on the episode too. That sounds great.
Cool.
Jay, I'm interested in the skull problem. So you mentioned like this quite practical issue. There's this quite thick thing in front of the brain. How do you know how dosage works, and could my skull be a different thickness to your skull?
That is one of the biggest problems. If everyone's skull was the same size, my job would be so much easier. But, but yeah, skulls vary a lot, and so we're typically going through the temporal window, so it's right, sort of behind your eyes, above your ear. That's the thinnest part of the bone. It's about 3 millimeters to 6 millimeters, 7 millimeters. It gets much thicker as you go back, and actually, for the default mode network, we try to go for the back of the head. The thing is like we're using very simple transducers right now. The tech is like 100 years old, basically. But ultrasound, as everyone knows, like when you do fetal imaging or imaging of the body, that's a pretty sophisticated transducer. There's a lot of tech that's gone into that. And so the ultrasound brain stimulation field is kind of catching up to the technology of ultrasound right now. There's a whole lot of researchers, MIT, Stanford, Harvard, like awesome researchers all really interested in this. And what you're seeing is like the tech that's been created is now being pulled in to the brain stimulation field. And so you're going to get more sophisticated tech over the next 5 years or so. And that's quite exciting. And then we get to see how powerful, it really can be.
Wow.
And let's say this thing develops as you have the problem that you want to have, and however many years, and this thing is uber effective, and can regularly get people to states that aren't currently available. What is the existential or practical risk that pops out when you hear that? Like when you go, "Oh God, well we need to mitigate against X, Y, Z." What is X, Y, Z?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think about it two ways. One way is that one thing we think is happening is we're changing the brain's ability to learn, called neuroplasticity. A lot of our work, like my work with Shenzhen, is kind of more focused on the plasticity than the states. And that's very intentional because, if you focus too much on the states, you get into the classical problems of Buddhism. But we worry, as I said, about what if you can target a part of the brain. I mean, we talked about the basal ganglia. Any of the neuroscientists out there worry when we start talking about that, and they should, because that's the same part of the brain that opioids are getting you addicted to, right? I mean, that's the whole network. And I don't think that you can get addicted to this tech. There's no evidence of that from any of the brain stimulation literature, except some old studies in the 50s we can talk about. But there is that possibility that if you hit the right spot, you give a person a state that they're just not ready to integrate. And that might then become a crutch for that person. So if you think about treating depression or anxiety, that's a global problem. Suicide rates are up, right? Everyone just lived through a pandemic. We're going to have a whole new generation of kids becoming adults who are having trouble coping with stress. Now you've created the super powerful tech that can help them deal with stress, but maybe not in an appropriate way for becoming a human who deals with the big stress, like climate
Yeah.
change or whatever's coming. Right. So that to me is the more realistic problem we're facing at this moment versus like giving someone a special state of classical Buddhism or something. Right. I don't think we're going to have that for a long time. But a person goes to a meditation retreat, they use the device and they have depression and they realize, oh, I'm just going to go use the device to feel better. That's a real problem.
It's funny. When I was about 17, and started having drinks with my friends, I used to feel this on a Friday during exam season. Like, this is so nice. Like, on one superficial level, like, I get why people do this. And I wouldn't know how stressed out I was until I had the beer, and then I went, Jesus, that's better. And I can see the equivalent being an issue here, especially if this thing becomes like a do-it-yourself at home device. Well,
Hmm.
now you're in. I think it's not. When you mentioned opioids, I understand the comparison. Yeah.
Yep. So, that's why for the creators of the tech, the intention, and I think the goal, the expectation of what you think is going to happen to the person is really important to define up front so that you're creating towards something helpful and useful for that person. And that's why, up front, we're thinking, more important to try to find how to make the system plastic so it can learn and change, and then, empower that person to change in the direction that's good for
Yeah.
them, which is
Yeah, that's good.
uh,
That's
that's
good.
a centuries old problem. How do you do that? The good life and all that, right? That's hard,
Yeah.
of course. But that way, you're not so focused on optimizing states, because if
Yeah.
you do that, I
Yeah.
think we got a problem here.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And actually it's the thing that it has the same flavor of the sorts of meditation teachers that I'm attracted to, the ones who aren't aiming at generating any particular state or trait, but rather helping me prepare my mind and body to be maximally well so that the endeavor happens smoothly and with few hiccups, and I'm in a position to learn quickly, like rather than trying to install one particular learning, get the system ready to learn. So you're sort of teaching the system how to learn rather than what to learn. I've always really appreciated that in teachers. So I don't think I've ever heard anybody in the neural enhancement community sort of speak like that. So that's very refreshing. That we're
Yeah.
not aiming at creating a jhana-like state. We're going to look at the kinds of ways that we can unlock some of the sticky stuff, and we can make it flow a little bit more, certain areas that are beneficial when they flow. And then we're going to put you in a training program. And all we're sort of doing is setting the right parameters, and then you can learn better in that condition, maybe, rather than we're just going to give you a way to hijack a particular state. It's good.
Totally. Thank you.
Yeah.
This isn't that different on one level to chatting about psychedelics unlocking certain states, right?
Yep. Yep.
And the danger there, you clearly think as well, there's a risk that something, like this, you end up with a mental health issue as a direct result of use. Is that something that you worry about at all here? Is there any kind of comparison?
Yeah, I'm usually careful about comparing this tech to psychedelics because psychedelics are so powerful and we're just not there yet. So I don't want to overpromise the tech. But I do actually think the tech will get there, especially once, Chat GPT-7 tells us how to build it, right? So, so whatever happens in the future, it gets weird. And I think that's why it's so important right now to build the container. And that's a lot of what Shinzen and I talk about in pretty much all my work at this point is we want to prepare the person, just as you said, Mark, prepare them for the moment they have that experience that they can't put into words that they've been reading about. If they're prepared for that, it's very useful. If they're not prepared, even in classic Buddhism, where you just go on a retreat for 3 months, you can have a state, get attached to it, and spend the rest of your life spiritually bypassing and hurting people. We see this all the time, in the Buddhist literature.
Yeah.
So, we have a lot of warnings there, and we kind of already know what to do. That's why our job's kind of easy. We just
Yeah.
update it and, kind of be part of this movement that's been going on for so long. And so, for example, when we think about creating like a meditation retreat protocol, so that's the next step for our lab at Arizona. We want to take the tech out to a retreat center.
Nice.
The first thing we tell people is this isn't about the tech, it's about integration.
Yeah.
So right there up front, you're loading them up with like what to look for. And I
Yeah.
think that's about as best we can do at the moment. But I think the psychedelic community is doing, a lot of people are doing the same thing. I talked to
Yeah,
people like
set and
Robert
setting turns
Marquez.
out to be crucial for psychedelics. Like,
Right.
what's
Yeah.
the training beforehand? What's the cool down afterwards?
Right. Right.
You get Shinzen into Zappa's brain? Has he been in? Has he used any of the
Shenzhen,
tech?
yes, has had quite a bit of ultrasound, maybe some of the most in human history, I would say, for his
Whoa.
brain. So he's, both of us take the approach that before we do it on anyone else, we do it on ourselves because we want to follow the practice of safety and understanding the effects and that kind of stuff. So both of us have done it. Shenzhen, I'd say he would average maybe once a month or twice a month. So we don't do it a whole lot. But every time we try a new protocol, Shinzen and I want to do it because we want to see like, what is this and is it useful? And that's what's so cool about working with Shinzen is I get to hang out with Shinzen all the time, which is amazing. It helps my own practice and he teaches me so much. But also, he is a phenomenologist in a sense, right? He has learned how to describe his states and experiences with such rich detail. So, he's kind of like our report vehicle, right? We do it on him,
Mm,
he reports, and he says, maybe you should change the protocol like this, or whatever. That becomes really helpful to designing that protocol so we
wow.
get the benefit out of it. Yeah, so it's pretty neat, to have that type of connection.
I've seen you talk about decision making in the context of this tech. What do you mean by decision making, and where does this become a question?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really connected back to this concept of goals. And, I think about things in the way that, like, Aristotle or someone would talk about it, where you've got a multi set of goals, but there's this long-term trajectory of your life. And you can ask, are the decisions you're making, are the things happening to you, the container, the context, the people in your life, are all of these things helping you get to something that is a better life, right? That's an ethical question, but the good life, the better life, something that's giving you richness and connection and meaning and purpose. And so, I think about decision making in that sense because on day to day, we're making all kinds of decisions that are very short term outcome. But ultimately, as humans, we also have this capacity to think into the millennia, right? Not just the future. I can think about if we get past this moment in human history, there's trillions of humans, right? I can think really far out into the future. And so that's part of the idea here is that if the tech is really working, we're helping people make those types of good decisions, right? The kind of decisions that are helping them find whatever they're looking for, which may be meaning, it may be, if you're Catholic, it might be something in that tradition. If you're Hindu, it's something in a different tradition. It doesn't matter, right? You have certain goals that define your life. And we want to make sure that the tech is helping to enable and empower that level of decision making.
Um, Jay, have there been any lessons that have emerged through doing the research that apply to kind of everyday meditators who obviously don't have access to the tech? Be it about either approach to meditation or the practices themselves.
That's a very good question. It's kind of funny because Shinzen's system, unified mindfulness, is really it's a tailored approach, and I think that I'm so lucky to get to hang with Shinzen because he is one of the world experts here. And part of the learning from all of Shinzen's going around and learning all the traditions of the world is that there's not a one size fits all. It's kind of obvious from a sort of biological point of view, but that's been really a hard lesson actually, because if we talked about what we just talked about, creating tech that's enabling and empowering a person to reach their long-term goals for meaning and purpose, and that's a hard thing to do. We've been talking about that as a species, I think, ever since we've started talking, right? But now we're sort of creating tech that might accelerate some of this stuff that we're talking about, and we're right at the edge of maybe it's going to go too fast, right? And so part of the lesson here is that the tech that we create needs to really be able to check in with that individual and understand, at this moment, are you getting closer? And then, 10 years down the road, is it really helping you? What are the people around you saying, right? So, it can't be this just like one pill or one brain area or one algorithm, right? It's got to be adaptive to the person and their needs and how they're changing. And that again gets to the fact that the sense of self will change, and then maybe one day the sense of self realizes there is no sense of self. Like, what do you do with that? So it's like the tech needs to be so adaptive that I think it really focuses long term instead of like a magic pill or something like that. So that's what we've learned. That's what I've learned working with Shenzhen, which kind of stinks because I'd like to retire at some point and go sit at the beach, But I think this is a multi-lifetime problem we're working on here.
Just to finish up, one question, and only because you've mentioned sitting on the beach. I was playing today with the idea of the fact that like comfort, at least in the sitting on the beach kind of comfort, is in 2023, if you were born in the Western world, achievable. Financially, it's like you can find very cheap places out in the world and you can have an income and you can live there, and people get sponsored to go meditate, for example, full time. But the reason we don't all go live in obscure parts of South Asia or on a beach is because that would be stressful. It sounds like it would be good on one level, but it wouldn't. What is it about the brain that can't sit still? Like, why is it that if I said to you, hey, Jay, you can go on holiday, but you're going to be there for 5 years, you go, whoa, hang on, that's too long. If the brain is this stasis, as you say, homeostasis seeking thing, what's the problem with just the beach for 5 years?
I don't think there's any problem. I mean, my brain's perfect.
Yeah,
My brain would be fine with that, actually.
Yeah, I would say after the 17th year of meditating, that sounds great.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't know if the movie Castaway is too old for your listeners. I don't know what the average age group is here. But there's this movie by Tom Hanks where he gets stranded on an island and he makes friends with a volleyball, I think, or a soccer ball.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's a beautiful movie, and it turns out Tom Hanks is really fascinated with being alone. So there's this TV show called Alone in the Woods, and there's like 20 seasons, and it's about people who are just alone. I've actually spent quite a bit of time camping alone when I was in college, my early years. And I'll tell you, after about day 3 for me, it's crazy hard to be alone, like to be that level of alone. And again, I think that's because I am a person with like social ties. So what really makes me who I am are the connections I have to the multifaceted social structure that I'm existing inside of. Even though a lot of times it feels like I'm separate, right? Like I feel right now, I'm separate from you guys. You're over there, wherever you are, I'm over here. But that really isn't true. I'm composed of all of these connections. And when you take this biological thing and put it on the beach, and then all that connection is gone, it's looking for it. And some unconscious level, it needs all that stuff. And so I think, if the people could sit there for like 10 years on the beach, they'd probably ultimately be okay. But then you become a different thing. You aren't you anymore. You're something totally different. And again, like that's the fun problem we're working on, but it's also the hard problem because it's really about sense of self and all the stuff, there's a reason the Buddhists talk about this stuff.
Jay, I think that's an awesome place to finish up. Where can everybody find you online?
Yeah, happy to have this chat. This was fun. You can look at our website. So the lab is called SEMA, SEMA lab at the University of Arizona. And then I have a website that's my name, jaysanguinetti.com.
Jay, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, so much fun.
This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it half as much as we did in recording it. And as always, we'll see you next week.